I think the One Law for All campaign has tried to actually get together as large a spectrum of people as possible. Douglas Murray, for example, is a supporter of One Law for All, as are Muslims and humanists and secularists and so on and so forth. We've got 27,000 people who've supported our petition and who've supported the campaign. So it isn't a question of excluding people just for the sake of excluding them. There are a lot of people in the One Law for All campaign who I would consider right-wing and most probably not want to be friends with, but if we agree on a specific mandate, which is to end Sharia law and to defend secularism and to get rid of all religious laws, then I think it's important to work together. But I also think that it's important to draw the lines. You know, we agree generally that the BNP is a fascist organization. Since February, it's been forced legally to include non-white members. But this doesn't necessarily make the BNP suddenly a non-racist organization or an anti-racist organization. And I think what's important is that when you look at political, I'm not talking about individuals, but political movements, political organizations, and states, for example, you do need to look beyond what they say to what they actually mean and what they're actually doing to make a judgment on their actions and on what they intend. For example, just because George Bush says the war on Iraq is for the promotion of human rights doesn't necessarily make it so. You know, so I think if you look at the EDL and Stop Islamization of Europe, they make a point of saying that they're not racist. And I think they're actually using, in a way, it gives credit to the anti-racist movement because they know how important it is to say that they're not racist, in the same way that Islamists will say criticizing Islam is racism, because they know that's a way they can evade scrutiny and they can silence people. And I think the far right are using that argument as well. They immediately come quickly and say, we're not racist. And for example, if you look at the EDL, and before I say that, let me say I've said for 20, 30 years now that criticizing Islam is not racism, Islamism are not racist. But you can still have organizations that are criticizing Islam that are racist. Now, just to give you an example, the EDL, for example, you have one of its spokespersons, Tommy Robinson, who has been a member of the BNP. His pseudonym is actually the name of a well-known football hooligan. You have supporters chanting, Muslim bombers off our streets, we hate Muslims. You have neo-Nazis bearing swastika tattoos. And they've actually then turned out to be EDL organizers and official stewards. And some of the things that they've said, for example, that is attacking Muslims and not Islamism, and that's the difference. For example, he said, I'm willing to go to the north of England and do what needs to be done for the mothers and children who've been caught up in this Muslim savagery. And in an interview, when the interviewer asked him, are you saying that every devout Muslim is under instruction to convert people and they're extremists? He said, yes, definitely yes. And you've got others like Mad Nick Gregor, who's been photographed wearing Nazi uniform and amid SS memorabilia. The Sikh, they've got they talk very much about having minorities in their group, like Gurmeet Singh, who's a spokesperson. He's said, for example, if the barriers break one day and our lads get through, we'll murder them all. And on his Facebook, he talks about there's no sort of thing as moderate Muslims, and someone who made fun of Muslim beards, he said, well, don't compare it to rats because rats deserve better than that. And at a rally, he's, for example, said, God bless every single person in the country, all religions, creeds, cultures, even God bless the Muslims. They'll need it for when they're fucking burning in hell. And so on and so forth. So, the fact that the organization says they're inclusive is not enough. That's the point that we're trying to make, that you need to look at what they're actually trying to do, and they're trying to promote a racist and anti-immigrant agenda. It's like saying that because there are women in the Islamic Republic of Iran's assembly, that is not sexist. Ridiculous, absurd. If you look at Stop Islamization of Europe, you don't need to look at their website. Just look at some of the comments that Stephen Gash, its founder, has made on our website alone. He says, before I go into that, their slogan, racism is the lowest form of human stupidity. Is that all racism is? Racism kills, it dehumanizes. It's one of the most vile things, and all they can come up with as their slogan is that it's a form of stupidity. And, one of the things he said, this is a quote, conflating anti-Islam with racism is ridiculous. We're openly hardline against Muslims, but that means Muslims of all races. Muslims are comprised of many races and kill non-Muslims of all races, and therefore race is not an issue. So basically, because there are white Muslims as well, their attack of Muslims is not racism. I'm sorry. You know, the co-founder, this is the other thing that racist organizations often do. Oh, the co-founder has mixed-race children. You know, where's the connection? Where's the logic to this? It's absurd. It's outrageous. It's an affront to our intelligence to say that these groups are also anti-Islamists. We need to work together. No. And that's what we're trying to say. No. We have to push them back. They are exactly the same as the Islamic movement. They are a far-right movement. The reason they have risen is because of the rise of the far-right across the world. That's why they've risen. And the appeasement of Western governments and so on and so forth. Just a few more examples. All of them, the EDL and the Stop Islamization in Europe, they've all gone to Paris and had a conference in December. And one of the French organizers has written to us saying, we're also fighting against the invading Muslims. And I wrote back saying, we're not fighting against Muslims, we're fighting against Islamism. And the minute you tell them that, you get this is the general answer. Well, you know, you can't fight Islamism without fighting Muslims, full stop. And you know what the founder of Stop Islamization of Europe has said? Islam requires Muslims, Nazism requires Nazis, communism requires communism, they're all filthy, we despise them. And so it's basically one thing they keep saying over and over again, there's no moderate Muslim. They all use taqiyya or whatever they use, and they'll say, even I'm an ex-Muslim, I'm an atheist, but I'm using taqiyya when I criticize them. Give me a break. You know, this is nonsense. And what I'm saying is, yes, we want to create the biggest movement we possibly can, but that does not mean, you know, you want to make Britain better? Well, why don't you join the BNP and join the Labour and Conservative? Everybody join together. You can't do that. This is politics. It's not a game. It's important. These are groups that are dehumanizing large groups of our population here and across the world. I just want to say a few more things to end, sorry. Just to say that Islamization of Europe, watch out, this is the words that they always use. They attack immigrants and demography. They're always talking about that. They have no problem with religion's role, but with Islam. They want to ban the Quran. And they use violence. If you look at actually they're very similar to the Islamic movement. Violence, they use religion, they want to appear as victim status. Christmas is no longer possible for Christians to practice in Britain. They're such a persecuted group. I mean, just ridiculous. And finally, I want to say, the thing that Islamists and the far right have is they promote collective blame. The Islamists will bomb every discotheque, every bus, every city, every citizen they can get their hands on, because they believe that everybody living in America or every woman who doesn't want to wear the veil in Iran is westernized and deserves to die. And in the same way the far right says, every Muslim, and for goodness sakes, not everybody who comes from Iran or Afghanistan or Pakistan is Muslim to begin with. And there are different types of Muslims anyway. Social groups, they don't see the protests and the working class movements within those countries and communities, and they do exactly the same thing. And so what we're saying is, it's not about us being exclusive, it's about being inclusive, but keep the racists and fascists out, otherwise we're not going to win. And yes, we, all of us, are part of that movement to stop Islamism. That's how things change. People, progressive social movements, and we are going to be successful, and we are going to happen. In fact, every single one of us in this room, except possibly Douglas.
I trust that most people here, one of the reasons why we're here is because we all agree that there is a problem of radical Islam, not just in Britain but in the world today, that a militant Islamist movement does exist. It's extremely powerful. Several countries are in its grip. It's growing, and it's growing in presence not only in individual countries, but in the UN and in communities in this country. It is real, it has a real presence, and it shouldn't be ignored. Now, that said, I now want to get on to insulting you. This problem, I would submit, ladies and gentlemen, will not be solved by everyone in this hall here tonight. Even by everyone on this panel. Noble sentiments, as I'm sure we'll all express. This hall and you will not solve this problem. You will not solve it on your own. it will require a whole range of people making their own individual points and their own individual positions to do that. And as maybe the only small C Conservative on this panel, maybe even in the hall, I'd like to make the following point, which is how much some of us object to the idea that there are parameters for debate and parameters of what is respectable within debate that will be decided solely on the left. There are all sorts of criteria that can be applied to your own personal judgment of what you think is right and wrong. But this debate will have to be had a lot more frankly if we're going to win it. The first thing I'd say is this. Just as in the Cold War, in the battle against communism, a vital component is a toolbox approach to defeating the enemy of Islamist extremism. Now, some of that will be people who you and I don't like. There are standards and norms which we can certainly express, but we should be exceedingly careful, I would submit, about where we draw those lines. Because before you know it, you'll be chucking out people who may well have perfectly legitimate points to make and who may well have, believe it or not, a larger following than any of us here tonight could ever have. Are there places you draw the lines? Of course. I think everyone in this hall would be in agreement. The British National Party is an overtly racist organisation. It always has been. There's not going to be a moment when it isn't. Nobody's going to join who doesn't believe in those fundamentally racist principles of the party. Are there people like that who will jump on this bandwagon? Sure. But we're going to have to be extremely careful in who else we lump in with them. We spend all of our time, and quite rightly, shouldn't stop doing it, differentiating out between different types of Islam, different types of Muslims, and so on and so forth. But the minute it's a group of white, middle-aged men, it's with huge delight that people decide, excellent, we will dismiss them as one single block, no need to investigate further. Let me give you an example. The English Defence League, an extraordinary phenomenon which, by the way, in my opinion, wouldn't have occurred if the government had have got a grip on al-Mujahirun. It only came about because the authorities didn't do anything about that particularly thuggish organisation. These things have consequences. The English Defence League, when they started protesting, had banners saying things like, you know, Sharia law discriminates against women. Sharia law is anti-gay. Well, I'm good with both of those sentiments. I'm sure most people in this room are. If you were ever going to have a grassroots response from non-Muslims to Islamism, that would be how you'd want it, surely. But, of course, we all know there are awkward things around this. There have been exposed links from the EDL with far-right organisations in individual cases, and maybe others will know more about this wider than that. But, you know, for instance, Louis Amis wrote a very interesting piece in Standpoint magazine some months ago after investigation, and he said, and others have said, that as far as they can see within the EDL, they have tried to kick out BNP elements. Does that mean that they aren't racist, or they aren't? I'm not making a definitive call. I'm just saying these things are extremely complex, and we ought to be careful before dismissing whole swathes of people. Thirdly, these groups stop the Islamization of Europe and stop the Islamization of America. I mean, I don't know enough about them, maybe. As far as I can see, Stop the Islamization of Europe only has a few members. And in America, Robert Spencer is one of the directors. I happen to know Robert Spencer. I respect him. He's a very brilliant scholar and writer. Now, some people in this hall may disagree with him, may disagree with all sorts of things he says. Well, sure, but Maryam Namazie sitting beside me is a communist. I disagree with Maryam Namazie on a whole range of things. She disagrees with me because I'm a conservative. But I don't think that Maryam Namazie should be out of the debate. I don't think anyone who was once a member of the Communist... I mean, I'm sitting on a panel with somebody who's a member of the Communist Party. Does that mean in future I should never be given a platform? The 20th century had two dreadful totalitarianisms, fascism and communism. Some of the people who people in this hall would throw out from being ever allowed to speak are being thrown out because once they met somebody who once sat on a platform with somebody who was once a member of a fascist party. Well, I'm sitting on a platform with a communist. That would mean I could never again speak in public if there was any sense to this debate. But there isn't, because people have this debate so ruddy badly. All spend their time polishing their halos. Yes, we're against racism. Yes, we're against fascism. We're against lots of things. But it's going to require a bit more than that, and a bit more of this halo polishing, if you're going to deal with that. And as I say, leave you with one final thought on that. If this battle is going to be won, it will not be won solely by the people sitting in Conway Hall here tonight. It will be won by a lot of people. We will have to make judgments along the way, and we'll disagree with them. I'll disagree with Maryam, I'll disagree with Shiraz, and all sorts of friends and colleagues. We'll disagree on individual cases and people. But the idea that you chuck whole swathes of people out of the debate is such a bloody left-wing thing to do. The left loves doing this all the time. The debate will be done on my terms. Well, how easy and how unsurprising it is that the terms are always drawn around themselves. I hope we can do a bit better than that. Thank you.
Well, my first response to this brief hijacking of criticism of Islamism by far-right groups, I thought, well, this is dead simple. Surely there aren't any nuances or contradictions to tease out. Because far-right groups don't make a distinction between Islamism and Islam, but we do. But when I visited the EDL website, I realized how nuanced the narratives have become. And as panelists before me have pointed out, that there is a huge gap between their street thuggery and the kind of language that they use. In fact, a lot of people are attracted to the organization because they don't see through to the racism underneath. I mean, I watched a YouTube video, and they're gathering for a demo, and in which setup would the leader have to tell the followers, no Nazi salutes? Now, this is supposedly an anti-racist party. So there is a lot of work to do to sift what I would call legitimate criticism from the racism of organizations like this. Now, on their website, they talk about the continued barbarism of so-called honor killings, a sentiment that we would agree with, especially at Southall Black Sisters. We felt, well, they're standing on our ground, and we need to respond to this. There are many arguments we can and have used over the years which set us apart from the far right. First of all, our critique of Islamism is placed in the framework of critiquing all religious fundamentalisms, be they Christian, Jewish, Hindu, or Muslim. So we argue that the control of women's bodies and minds are at the heart of all fundamentalist projects. And this is an attempt to take away from the focus from Islam. It is not to undermine or to diminish the importance of the threat that Islamism poses at this moment. And given the political context, of course, at the moment of the rise of pan-Islamism, the running sore of the Palestinian struggle, Chechnya, Kashmir, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, all of which support a fundamentalist narrative of victimhood. And again, the relative quiescence of Christian evangelism, at least in the UK, this does make this argument a little bit more difficult to make. Secondly, women are murdered by men in all cultures, and yet culture is the prism through which we view only the actions of minorities. So a white man may defend a murderous attack on a woman because she was having an affair, his wife, maybe. Crime of passion, jealousy, honor, different labels, but they're all about the control of women. Thirdly, we do not make sweeping allegations against all black or Muslim men by examining the way patriarchy operates in a particular community. By particularizing it, our perspective cannot be seen as racist. Fourthly, by the sheer fact of our existence, of being who we are, women from minority communities, fighting for the human rights of black women, we undermine the idea of homogeneity of minority communities, undermine the view that all Muslims are backward and oppress their women. And finally, the solutions that we put forward, such as the need to develop a culture with strong sanctions against interpersonal violence, where women have economic power and autonomy within and outside the home, where the definition of masculinity is not linked to male dominance or honor, and where there is equality of decision-making and resources within the family. This would be anathema to the far right, where patriarchal modes of thinking are equally, if not more, entrenched. The solutions proposed by the far right, on the other hand, to these issues are usually linked to restricting immigration, a pressure to which both Tory and Labour governments have been extremely susceptible, and that is the real danger for us. How governments attempt to head off the far-right threat by stealing some of their clothes. Our campaign on forced marriage is an example of this. In response to the demand that we've been making for protection of women, such as more refugees if they're facing forced marriage, the government's response is to raise the age limit from 18 to 21. So this, I think, is some of the real danger that is posed by the far right, is the pressure to which governments feel susceptible and feel that their draconian immigration agenda is justified by kowtowing to them. So these, I think, are the real problems for us.
I'll briefly tell you what the situation is in France at the moment, as far as hijacking the secular agenda by the far right and the right was. As you may have seen in the newspapers, Marine Le Pen is now heading the National Front, and it is expected that she will have more than 50% votes in the next presidential elections, which are in a year and a half. But this doesn't happen in a vacuum. The rise of the far right, the traditional far right, is there all over Europe. In Norway, Netherlands, Austria, Hungary, the far right has more than 50% voters. In Switzerland and Serbia, it's more than 30%. And France and Denmark are expected to have growing numbers of voters for the far right. So the problem is that these people are hijacking the agenda of defense of secularism, which is now conceived as a fence against Muslims, quote unquote, i.e. citizens of mostly North African descent from Muslim countries, and it's a tool for identity politics. But there are also new forces which are on the right of the far right, the traditional far right, and they are on the rise too. There's especially an organization called le Bloc Identitaire. Identity bloc or identitaire, does that mean anything? Okay, I'll just quote what they stated. It started in 2003, and it has now been joined by quite an important group called Riposte Laïque, secular riposte, which runs a website and has common actions with the Bloc Identitaire. And both also hijack the struggle for secularism and distort the meaning of secularism. For example, Muslim fundamentalists in Paris, in the heart of Paris, not in the suburbs, have been for 5 years now occupying streets for Friday prayers, and they put the police fences so that no car can get into it with a sign of no entry. And it has been going on for 5 years. The police doesn't do anything. So Bloc Identitaire and Riposte Laïque are now organizing picnics with, I quote, wine and pork in the same streets. So they are really looking for physical confrontation. And let me just quote something that the Bloc Identitaire said about itself. In the issue number 1 of ID magazine, Why We Are Identitaire, it states that French Revolution broke, I quote, cultural communities based on regional identity and genetic identity. And again, I quote, the dominant ideology pretends that identity is exclusively a personal choice. We contest this dogma. in their provocative actions and common actions, there's also the defense in court of a woman who ran a guest house and threw out of her guest house 2 veiled women because she didn't want them to be veiled in the common spaces of the guest house, which is perfectly illegal. The woman was condemned. But these groups paid for lawyers, paid for publicity in the newspapers, etc. So I think it's important for us to realize that when secularism becomes part of the official agenda of the National Front and of further right forces, we are having a problem to continue defend secularism and not be used by these people. The state goes exactly along the same lines, and Sarkozy is revising the very definition of secularism in France, which, may I remind you, stems from the 1905-1906 laws, in which it is stated that the state declares itself incompetent in religious matters. It's not just separation, it's more than separation, and will in no case, no instance, finance religious whatever operations. There is pressure on France to abandon, pressure by Europe to abandon this definition of secularism and move towards equal tolerance by the state of different religions, which is what you have in Britain. As you know, Sarkozy has been creating out of the blue, top to bottom, the French Council of Muslims in France, and also setting up a Minister of National Identity, which seeks to define identity. As a consequence, 42% of the French people now considers Muslims, quote unquote, as a threat to their identity, I also quote, and 2/3 of voters on the right considers Muslims as a peril. He's now financing places of worship, etc. Let me just quote him 2 recent statements. When he visited the Pope, Sarkozy said, "The school teacher will never be able to replace the priest." That's the discours of Latran. And he also stated, "The secular republic gets into an ongoing dialogue with religions that are practiced on its soil so as to listen to them." It's a far cry from separation and incompetence of the state and not financing religions.
I'm going to speak slightly more abstract terms than the 2 previous speakers. I mean, I think it goes without saying, and I don't think we need to spend a lot of time, if any, establishing the fact that some of the groups mentioned in the sort of blurb and run-up to this event, the EDL, the BNP, SIOE, Stop Islamification of Europe, are out-and-out racist organizations, and I think we can probably start by sort of working from that premise. And building on the fact that these groups have tried to confer upon themselves a veneer of respectability and to confer upon themselves the veneer of legitimacy by claiming that their politics is about something much more sophisticated, something much more progressive, i.e. fighting against Islamism, which I think everyone, again, in the room would recognize as a threat to the normative values of our society, to our security, and to the sort of future direction in which we wish to head as a country. And in that respect, we really have to begin to see increasingly these organizations that do operate on the far right and that do try to present themselves as legitimate partners in this fight as being the flip side of the same problem that we are ultimately seeking to defeat in Islamism itself. We see groups such as MPAC condemned, by parliamentary reports and condemned by everyone who knows what they're about as being a deeply anti-Semitic and racist organisation who attempt to do the exact same thing for themselves by claiming that they're not anti-Semitic but that they're anti-Zionist, and to try and say we have a legitimate political disagreement, we disagree on a matter of policy rather than stand for in that sense. So these two problems are essentially flip sides of the same coin, but they come from the same sense of hatred and prejudice and discrimination and bigotry, and certainly that underlies their political and philosophical worldview. Look, that view has flourished in the far right in particular to an extent in recent times, and it's been able to do that partly because of the wider social and economic factors that we might all look at. But of course, there has been a failure and a lack of desire and inability and inertia of the political class to also directly confront Islamism and to be willing and wanting to challenge it and directly go for it. And unfortunately, as a result of that, to some extent, the proponents of the anti-Islamist cause who come at it from the far right have been able to mainstream their arguments and their side of the debate in a way that is quite unpalatable and that is quite problematic, and it requires and it deserves our attention and our concern, and I think this event is largely a manifestation of that. To my mind, at least, the overriding philosophical sort of, I suppose, maxim of what is happening with these sort of organizations is the idea that my enemy's enemy is my friend. And they've been able to utilize that in order to move their side of the debate much further than we could really ever expect to. And to say this is not to go into the terrain of Saeed Awasi's recent comments and her dinner party test, which I reject and which I disagree with, but I think ultimately where she's coming from is sort of misunderstanding this problem. There is an issue here which is broader than what is happening in this country. Just as Islamism operates and feeds off a wider international climate and it's bouncing off that and responding to that, so too is the far right. You saw the debate, no one in this room will have missed it, that surrounded the so-called Ground Zero Mosque in America, which is neither at Ground Zero nor is it a mosque, but through the sort of propagation by far right people there, Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, this debate was mainstreamed in a quite remarkable and disturbing way, to the point where people like Newt Gingrich are saying no mosque at Ground Zero until there are churches or synagogues in Saudi Arabia. To what standard does that hold American Muslim citizens in his own backyard? To what extent does he want to hold America to comparable moral standards as Saudi? This is not the way for the debate to proceed. So I think in that sense, that's all I really wanted to say, that this is a domestic problem. It has a large international component, has a component that needs to be tackled, and ultimately it needs to be seen as being a different manifestation of the same problem coming from the same basis. And in that sense, we need to tackle this collectively on the basis of shared values and tackle it on that basis, because ultimately what is it that we're fighting for? What is it that we're looking to protect and preserve? And none of these people, whether they come from the Islamist tradition or the far-right tradition, would share that with any of us.
Thank you. A couple of things very, very briefly in the 2 minutes I have. The first is this, in the, some of the comments came, let me just flag up a couple of things. It will not be possible to defeat Islamist extremism whilst denigrating, for instance, people in this country who are concerned about immigration. It's not possible, because a very, very large proportion of people in this country are concerned about immigration. It tends to be the number one, or if not number one, two issue in polling in this country. So, as it were, those people who just say, you know, people who talk about immigration all the time, you know, those people aren't beyond the pale. They might be perfectly decent. They are, in most cases, perfectly decent people who are concerned about an issue. And I don't think it should be glibly dismissed any more than people who are concerned about demographics. There are people who have serious concerns about demographics because they're seriously concerned that the society they were born into is changing beyond recognition. That doesn't mean they should be dismissed as whack-job kooks or racists. They might have a perfectly legitimate point. I think they do. The second thing, it was demonstrated by one of the people who said, the gentleman there, talked about, you know, going to the protest of the Pope rally. If I may say so, this, you know, I wasn't there, I didn't approve of the protest because there were various things around that I think are complete guff. One of them is the fact that people love saying they went to the protest the Pope thing. The Pope, the sort of, Pope's not on board with gay marriage. I'm a gay man. I'd love to have gay marriage approved by the Catholic Church. But, they're not going to. Meantime, I really, really wish that people would reserve their ire for the people who don't just want to stop me marrying, but want to throw me off a cliff. Much better way to spend your time. But of course people love it because they think, oh, I'll attack the Islamists, but then to be allow myself to do that, I can attack the Pope to show I'm not a racist. Show me a Monsignor, grab me a cardinal, and I can attack them because that will allow me. This is left-wing nonsense. Again, paedophile priests, you said. If you'd have just stood there and said, I'm trying to protect Muslims from paedophile imams, people would go, oh, how Islamophobic. And actually, in that case, it probably would be. But you say paedophile priests and smear the Catholic priesthood, and it's not a problem. Thirdly, finally, getting toward the end, a lot of this problem comes down, and the question we didn't get onto tonight, the fact is this: at the end of the Second World War, the Nazi leaders were tried and executed. At the end of the Cold War, it didn't happen. One of the biggest problems we have is the fact that it wasn't resolved. The people who did the largest massacres, the largest number of deaths caused by any movement in history, were not brought to trial. It's thought of as Guardian, the leading left-wing newspaper, had Richard Gott, one of its editors, a paid member of the KGB, a paid KGB agent who said, oh, it was just a bit of a laugh. Oh, and it still is just a bit of a laugh. Because if it's communism, it's a bit of a laugh. 70 million dead here and there, a bit of a laugh. And so on. So please, let's adjust our fucking values. And finally, a lot of this is a simple mental breakdown of the left. I hesitate to say this in the presence of Nick Cohen, who's chronicled this better than anyone. But the mental breakdown of the left, the fact that at so-called left-wing meetings, we have the obsessions with Palestine, for instance. There was one recently, again, I saw Gays for Palestine. Give me a break. If Gays for Palestine were in Palestine, they'd have to move to Israel. Just don't fall for this rubbish. And don't fall for it when it's coming from the right or the far right. And don't fall for it when it's coming from the left or the far left. Have some decency.
I do want to talk about the pro-Islamist left because I do think it's very important, though there's so many issues that are going to remain unanswered. But anyway, I think with the pro-Islamist left, the problem primarily is that they also see my enemy's enemy as my friend, and because they perceive the Islamic movement to be anti-imperialist, they defend it irrespective of what these movements and states do. And in a sense, it's sort of if you look at it, it's sort of an old anti-colonial movement. It sides with the colonies no matter what happens, and it's a sort of patronizing Eurocentric view of the colonies, and it's usually siding with the ruling elite of those colonies. So it doesn't matter how many people are massacred by Ahmadinejad, they'll defend Ahmadinejad and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I've got personal experience with this in the Stop the War Coalition. When the Twin Towers happened, the bombing, we went to the Stop the War Coalition meetings, and one of the arguments we had is you've got to condemn Islamic terrorism. They refused to do it. And we've had actually our activists who've got banners of against human rights violations in Iran, their banners grabbed off them and thrown out of the protest, whereas you've got banners of the Islamic Republic of Iran's flag, we are all Hezbollah, we are all Hezbollah. You've got lesbian women carrying that banner, and you're like, you wouldn't be alive under Hezbollah's rule, And, at one protest, I stopped going to them because every woman veil in respect for Muslim women. Well, a lot of women under Islamic laws are fighting tooth and nail not to be veiled. They're having acid thrown in their faces and they're resisting. And you're telling us in London to veil in solidarity with the Palestinian women or the Iraqi women. There are a lot of these sorts of examples. United Against Fascism, we had a rally against Sharia law in front of Downing Street. Al-Muhajirun did a counter-demonstration against us. United Against Fascism led a rally against the EDL, who had also come for a counter-demonstration, and joined Al-Muhajirun. Come on! How can you be anti-fascist and join the Islamic fascists? Their response, there's no such thing as Islamic fascism, and that's the problem. The problem is that they don't see the fact that there are women, there are gays, there are atheists, free thinkers, socialists, left, right, human beings who are being smashed by this movement. And who are struggling and resisting it day in and day out, and they're siding with the oppressor. They're siding with the oppressor. So I think, especially as I'm on the left, I feel such a betrayal from this movement. And you know, that they're siding with Islamism, they're taking Islamic side at our expense, at the expense of people's rights. I just want to say one thing, though, that we're not talking about people, and that's where I think there's some dishonesty going on in these debates, because we're not talking about your neighbor who's anti-immigrant. As the head of the One Law for All campaign that has gathered, you know, 27,000 supporters in a very short time, and that has been challenging the Islamic movement day in and day out, I have a responsibility to target and bring light to and expose not just Islamism, but also the far right that is hijacking that issue in order to attack Muslims, other citizens in this country. A movement that doesn't give a damn about the stoning of Sakina Mohammadi Ashtiani. That Muslim bitch deserves to die. Those are the sorts of emails you get from them. Okay, so I have a responsibility. I'm not talking about individuals. Your neighbor might be anti-immigrant. I don't care. But when you have a movement that is organizing people, bringing football hooligans into the street, I have a right to attack them and condemn them. That is my job as an activist. And just as they have a right to speak, I have a right to speak. And I won't stop speaking about this. I think it's important. We have to distinguish who our enemies are, because we will not win if you have the far right taking over the debate. The governments refuse to decide this. The vast majority of people are anti-Islam, but they're not racist. They have to see a non-racist, anti-racist alternative to fighting Islamism, and we are that alternative. And that's why I think it's important. This seminar is one of many seminars, conferences, rallies we've had, but this issue is one that we've been grappling with and felt we needed to focus on this. So maybe you think we're not dealing with all the issues, but the reason for this is because this needs to be discussed and addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, hello. I'm conscious of the fact that there's very little time left for me, and almost everything I wanted to say has already been said by Maryam. I just wanted to draw attention to a couple of things. One is that it's not just the betrayal from the traditional left that we're talking about, but as an earlier speaker referred to the whole Mozambique fallout, we also have the human rights lobby, which is completely confused about where it should stand on this issue, and this is a really big problem. I mean, we have been dogged by the betrayal of the left from the moment that Southern Black Sisters came into being in 1979, because if every time we tried to raise issues around domestic violence, we were told that this is not the right time by our brothers on the left. So it is never, every time you want to expose the underbellies of our communities, we are told that this is not the right time to do it. And although in the 30 years the situation has changed because there have been different players, and one might argue that I think in contradiction perhaps to one of the earlier speakers that maybe it was from the floor, that actually I would argue that things are worse, that the war on terror that the state has embarked on and the continuing draconian immigration legislation has meant that actually we are in a much worse situation, more racist situation than before. And so that does allow the left to hide behind that and not to take on and challenge the alliances that they form with various extreme right Muslim fundamentalist organizations. And we saw that last year in Tower Hamlets, when there was an attempt, when there was a venue in Tower Hamlets that was organizing a conference where extremist Islamic speakers were going to be present. The EDL decided to hold a demonstration against that. When the council actually wrote to the venue to say that the conference should be cancelled, which they did. The EDL demo was also cancelled. What happened at the march that was organized by the Left Alliance, there were calls saying that the council was craven for having banned the conference. So this is the problem, that you are not able to tackle Islamism within, not Islamism, but fascism within your own alliances, and you're fighting fascism outside, and it can't be done. Both things need to be challenged. We need to have a sort of Janus-headed position on this, fighting fascism across black, brown, and white fascism. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm afraid, starting with the gentleman there who made the point, you're guilty of hearing what you wanted to hear rather than what I said. I did not attack those who supported, or who were against, the Ground Zero Mosque. I did not say that. I understand the debate. It's not a debate that we're having tonight. I attacked two of the personalities involved in spreading a particular vitriol around that debate, and I named both of those individuals, and it was about the individuals as examples of people I would regard as being beyond the pale. That's the first point. The second point is you go on to speak about the EDL having a Jewish division, a gay division, and so on, as if this should sanitize the organization. Well, Natura Carter, go and meet with Ahmadinejad. Are we going to hold that up as an example of sanitizing him, right? People always say, where are the Muslims? Well, I speak as a Muslim. I've been engaged in this work and working with people against Islamism in this country. There are lots of Muslims in this room who do, and yet we are very quick. We do it ourselves. I do it in identifying Islamists by their words, by their associations, by their platforms, taking them at their own value by the words that they say. And yet we are expected, on the flip side, to reverse our values when it comes to people who oppose Islamism, or say they do, such as the EDL, and then we're being told, where are the Muslims? Well, this is from the spokesman of the EDL. The video is on YouTube. It was transcribed today in our office. Allah, fuck it. Fuck 'em. Fuck 'em. I'm not being funny. Fuck 'em. I'm going to get arrested for this shit, but fuck 'em. Fuck 'em. Fuck 'em. I'm not having it. Fuck 'em. Now that's from Gurmjit Singh. This is the head of the EDL. This is a spokesman for the EDL. You want to talk more about the EDL today? A good colleague of mine, sat at the back, sent those pictures through from the Facebook pictures of prominent EDL members, swastikas, Combat 18 symbols. If you want to throw your values out the window just because someone says that they're anti-Islamist, you can do that. But I will not be part of that movement. We are only going to win this on the basis of values and the equal application of those values. And this is where, unfortunately, too much of the debate on the right has been lost. And I will identify with, I think the reason Douglas identified himself as a small C conservative is because he believes I'm a large C conservative. But regardless of that, this is a side of the debate that I feel passionate about. The left is not ultimately where I see myself engaging, but I feel disheartened with the way I see this debate going, and I'm afraid, despite you emailing me just a couple of weeks ago, this is where I feel it's very difficult for us to work together, because I will not compromise my values and principles for a short-term gain.
Thank you very much.
If we look at the reasons why, not just the left, but also the anti-globalization movement and human rights organizations do not stand by us, to put it mildly, because I think they are our worst enemies at some point. I think on the one hand, there's this intellectual laziness, which prevent them from analyzing the problem of the Muslim right, of Muslim fundamentalism in political terms rather than in religious terms. And also the belief that fundamentalists are a popular resistance that needs to be supported, a resistance of the wretched of the earth. Well, we perfectly know that all classes are represented amongst fundamentalists. They also believe that fundamentalists are anti-capitalist, which of course they are not. So if we look at these reasons, maybe we can target better the number of people who believe that they should not oppose fundamentalism. If I can say one thing, not on the left, but on human rights organizations, because maybe it will be less discussed. They focus on state accountability, at least they claim that they will only focus on state accountability because only states are signatories to international treaties. But we know very well that when states target communists, for instance, they don't stand up in the way they stand when the state attacks fundamentalists in some countries. There's also an enormous difference between the means that they put into the defense of fundamentalists and the means they put into the defense of their victims. Just to give two examples, the European tour of Mozambique was organized by Amnesty International, and the Center for Constitutional Rights in the US just put a lot of money in defending Awlaki, who is the number 2 of Al-Qaeda in the Arabic Peninsula. They also withhold information which we give them. They don't put them in their annual report. I'll stop there. Just want to remind you that on Monday it will be the first anniversary of Gita Sehgal being kicked out of Amnesty International. I think we should support her.
Thank you very much.